We're all aware that we now live in a world where the threat of terrorism is a constant. And when an attack is claimed or thought to have been carried out in the name of religious fundamentalism, it puts a strain on interfaith relationships and challenges the values of our multicultural society. Some claim that the attacks are lone wolf or extremist aberrations. Others see them as a threat to the kind of tolerant society that has evolved in Europe over the centuries. The strongest and most consistent representative of this position is the writer and campaigner Douglas Murray. In his latest book, The Strange Death of Europe, he contends that we are sleepwalking into catastrophe because of our fear of being thought of as prejudiced. And he's with me now. Good morning, Douglas.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Now, let's get a sense of what shaped you by starting at the beginning. You were born in London, but your name proclaims a Scottish background. So tell us what role the Isle of Lewis plays in your story and how you ended up down there.
Well, you can tell from my accent I'm not myself from the Isle of Lewis. My father, or my father's family are all from the island. My father grew up there. He's a Gaelic speaker, as are all my family on that side. And he came down to London after school, I suppose. And so he and all that part of the family, well, it's all very much part of my upbringing, part of my sort of inheritance, really.
And is it true that your grandfather was the schoolmaster in Tong?
That's right, yes.
And
yes.
President Trump's mother went there.
Yes.
So you've got a genetic connection.
One has to be careful about these things. I suppose. I mean, yes, it's a... There are some places in the world where everything seems to go back to them, and strangely enough, the village of Tong in the Isle of Lewis is one such place.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Donald Trump's mother grew up there just beside my grandfather, who my grandfather was the schoolmaster in the local school, and yes, one of his pupils was the later to be Mrs. Trump.
Yeah, so it's clearly one of those kind of cosmic hotspots from which things reverberate.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Did your Scottish ancestry feature at all in daily life at home? I mean, did you talk about it? Did you think back longingly to those Hebridean roots, or was it just something that was over?
No, I think it's it's impossible when I used to go up a lot as a boy. We used to go up every summer and other times in the year. And it's impossible when you know a landscape and a place as beautiful, really, as Lewis, that you could sort of forget about it. So, in a way, certainly for somebody like me growing up in the city, I think that sort of memories of Lewis and thinking of Lewis was very strong. It couldn't not be. It's such a hauntingly beautiful place and such a strong cultural identity of its own. I never learnt Gaelic, but I learnt little bits of it, obviously, and they always featured in daily life. And I think to this day, my father and I always say, if we're somewhere together, we all say good night in Gaelic and so on. And I suppose religiously, a part of that was also trickled through, although not the sort of most hard form of Presbyterianism, which the islands definitely, help inculcate.
Yeah, and there's a bit about that I kind of respect. I mean, they fought against all the kind of 20th century changes, travelling on the Sabbath, all of that. One felt almost a kind of mourning for a way of life that was passing. Do you think you've inherited some of that wistfulness for the way we discard the past almost promiscuously in our culture?
It's possible, yes. I occasionally have pangs of that. About a year ago or so, there was actually a campaign by various humanist and secularist societies to raise money for the opening of a swimming pool in Lewis that was shut on Sundays, and to sort of raise money for it to open, because one of the sort of last reasons for it not to be was there wasn't money to do so, whereas in fact it was obviously just trying to keep hold of the tradition of not doing things like that on the Sabbath. And I have to say, whilst having mixed views on that, I think these things are for the local people to decide. I did feel a sort of twinge of irritation, really, that it would be people who've never been to the community in question trying to change that community's way of life. And yes, I think in general I regret that sort of thing. But I think these are decisions people have to make for themselves, not to have imposed upon them.
At the local level. Tell me a little bit about your kind of take on religion at the moment. In one of his poems, C.D. Lewis describes himself as a wistful child of unbelief. Wistful. Am I right in detecting a certain wistfulness towards Christianity in your own position, Douglas?
Yes, I think so. I was a very, I say, not only believing but fairly devout Christian for most of my life. It survived university, survived school, and into my 20s. Then, as I wrote at the time, I had a sort of long period of doubt, and eventually rather, I suppose, strident atheism. That's not uncommon, as you know, that when people lose their faith, the first thing they do is to go completely against the whole thing. I'm still not a literal believer, but I don't have that. I don't have that stridency, I think, and I don't like it as much as I did back then. It's partly because I think there's something unforgiving in the approach. There are whole ranges of things that sort of atheism doesn't address and finds itself as a result that it can't address.
One of the things, we're going to come to the book in a minute, but one of the things I quite appreciated in the book is that you retain an affection for Christianity and value the role it played in European history and actually getting us to this strange kind of spiritual sectarian balance we've achieved, and you think that's passing. So, and Christianity's part of that.
Yes, I mean, this is really one of the main, if not the main reason why I come to the softer view on this than I've had before, because if you survey our culture, our continent, it's impossible to write out Christianity from it, or if you take a fair-minded approach, not to recognize that a very great deal, not all, but a very great deal of what we have and enjoy does come from there. I'm persuaded by the argument that human rights, for instance, are a sort of post-Christian inheritance that comes that way. And if you recognize that, you can't war on the source of it. You might disagree with the source of it, you may not even believe in the source of it, but if you enjoy the things that has produced, I think you have to have a more forgiving attitude towards it, and certainly, as I say, not to war against it. These are very difficult things because, as you know, it means you have to have an attitude to a thing which you yourself may not be able to sustain. But nevertheless, which you want to be sustained, or you want the product of it to be sustained. And I think a lot of us today are living in that space. We don't want to war on our origins, but nor can we be the believers we used to be. So what do? I don't have the answer to it, but I know that the question, and to be involved in the question, is some way to getting there.
Yeah, I like that kind of complexity, and we're going to come back to it. What made your parents decide to take you out of the state school you went to and send you to a prep school and then to Eton? Because that does a particular kind of forming of a child.
Yes, my parents were great believers in the state school system, as we all were. And I and my brother were educated throughout at state schools. I mean, we also wouldn't have had the money to send us to, Eton or whatever from the start. But we went through the state sector, had a somewhat bad experience. It was one of those schools where actually all the teachers can do to succeed is to keep the peace. It was hard to transmit any learning because really it just was crowd control. And I, as a child, I mean, I recognized that, and my parents swiftly recognized that. And there was this way out, which I was very musical, and this was a route to the sort of scholarship route. And so, yes, I managed to get to this small private school in West London, a Catholic school called St. Benedict's. And then from there, I had the, life-changing experience of then having experienced, as it were, the worst of the education system, then experiencing the best, which Eton is. I mean, it is an extraordinary school, and they provided a full scholarship, which is my my parents said at the time, it would be more expensive for us to keep you at home. And it was a great formative experience, and I just always wish every child could experience the encouragement and the nurturing and the intellectual fire, really, that I found that school to be.
You're listening to Sunday Morning with me, Richard Holloway, on BBC Radio Scotland, and my guest today is the political writer Douglas Murray. Now, Douglas, you realise when you were only 13 that you were gay. I mean, difficult? How did you handle that?
I suppose it came as a realisation, as it does to a lot of people, sort of gradually and then fast. I suppose I was growing up in the early 90s then, and I sort of... It's very difficult looking back at things like that, because you can easily, in retrospect, make them seem to be easier than they actually were when you were going through them. But at the time, it was definitely very difficult. It was a time when if you wanted to reach out and find out what this thing was, as it were, you didn't have very much to find out. You, certainly in my case, I immediately tried to read any books that were available. There were authors who I knew had also felt this, and I read their works. Not much of that was enormously applicable. I remember there were lots of things. I remember reading In Memoriam of Tennyson's at a very early stage, because I'd sort of been gathered that there was something sort of vaguely in this area. That was, of course, was a huge disappointment for anyone trying to find out about what it was like to be gay. And I mean, it was the same with trying to find out in the press at that time, of course, because it was not at the height of AIDS, but just after it. And definitely there was a terrible fear about that. The idea, I mean, everything, all gay literature, for instance, at that point, it seemed every novel about what this thing was about death, was about contracting this terrible illness and dying. And I know a lot of people, heterosexual and homosexual, felt that at the time, but it was definitely a scary way to learn about that aspect of one's life.
You took an interest in the life of Oscar Wilde and his friend and lover Alfred Bosie Douglas. You went on to write a book about Bosie. Being a wistfulness junkie myself, I love some of Bosie's poetry. He was a minor poet, but I love the nostalgia. I've been through the woods today. Tell us about him and why you wrote his book. And was that a kind of a breakthrough thing for you?
Yes, it was. I was at school. I was still at St Benedict's at the time. I'd read, as I say, I'd been reading to try to, find out all sorts of things. I mean, it wasn't just the gay thing, but it was just an intellectual curiosity about all sorts of things. And I was interested in the Wilde story. Of course, I mean, it goes without saying, even then, he was one of the very few, very prominent gay people anyone of my, background would have found. But really, I mean, the story, of course, of Wilde is famous and famously tragic. But I became very interested in this figure who was central to it and then disappeared from history, it seemed, Alfred Douglas. And I became very interested in him. And then when I was at school, I was finding out things out. There's a sort of one common thread in my life, which tends to be that I try to find the things out that it looks like you're not meant to find out. And I found it very hard to really locate any information about Alfred Douglas. This was, of course, pre-internet. Now one could just get on Google. But it meant that, yes, I got very interested in his life, and as I got more interested and into the poetry and so on, I discovered that he was an underrated figure historically. And yes, I mean, it made me a writer. I slightly amazed. I sort of stumbled into it. I hadn't set out to do that. I certainly hadn't set out to write a book. It happened, and I suppose once you've written a book, you're a writer, for better or worse.
That's right, and it's a good addiction to have. In 2007, you founded the Centre for Social Cohesion. Tell us about that. What was that about?
Well, after my first book, I was already beginning to get very interested in politics, current affairs, never party politics. I never cared for any of that. But I was gradually aware, I suppose, after the 9/11 period, and I'd had a little bit of a head start on that with an Iranian friend who was a writer who had already warned me, as it were, before 9/11 of what was to come. She really schooled me in the knowledge of the hard-line form of her faith that had made her and her family flee Iran, and So when 9/11 happened, I sort of knew what this was, and in the years after that, I became increasingly concerned. And a set of events happened, particularly the murder of Theo van Gogh in Holland, the Dutch filmmaker, in 2004, and then the London bombs in 2005. And it seemed to me that in Britain, still at that stage, despite having had by then our first suicide attacks, the discussion, the debate, and indeed the information on these things that had happened was very sparse. It was still sort of lacking. There was, I think, a quite what we would look back on now as quite a sort of juvenile debate about the whole thing, and also a scared debate about the whole thing. And that's understandable, of course. But I set up this small centre. I found some supporters who also recognised, well, journalism and elsewhere, that this was an important area to try to provide research on. And so we did, and we did I think the first studies in Britain of a range of associated problems, some of them quite tough, some of them, as it were, ones that you could get broader a political alliance on, things that are now very commonplace to talk about, like honour killings and female genital mutilation, but which really hadn't had much of a public airing at that point, and we tried to break some of that bubble and break through it, and I think did.
And we're going to look at some of those issues in a minute. You're listening to Sunday Morning with me, Richard Holloway, here on BBC Radio Scotland. My guest today is the political writer Douglas Murray. We'll hear more in a minute, but first, Douglas, you've chosen some music, and this is Thomas Tallis' Spem in Alium. Why this?
Well, it's a piece I can never listen to without being very moved. It's as many listeners will know, it's one of the most extraordinary works of polyphony. It's Thomas Tallis writing for 40 individual voices, and I think, by the way, there's a sort of inbuilt joke, it's always seemed to me, from Thomas Tallis, because the text, of course, says in Latin, but says, I've never put my trust in anyone else but you, O Lord God of Israel. And I've always thought, as I've watched the conductor and once sung in a performance of this myself, that there's something in it that the individual singer is saying, I've never put my trust in anyone but in thee. Because you can't really even trust the conductor in this piece, who's just a metronome, and if you get lost, you're lost. But it's the great work of that period, and just a masterpiece of human achievement.
Well, let's glory in it. Spem in Alium by Thomas Tallis, performed by the Oxford Camerata, conducted by Jeremy Summerlee, the choice of my guest today, author and political commentator Douglas Murray. And it was fabulous, wasn't it?
Isn't it magnificent?
Now, Douglas, before your first music choice, I wanted to get a sense of where you'd come from, because your latest book, The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, Islam, is a book that many are going to find challenging. It's a brilliant, disturbing, apocalyptic and profoundly pessimistic book. And I'd like to follow your three themes in our discussion. But the first question I want to ask is about the difficulty of having the discussion at all. One of the things you actually raise. Migration is such a hot issue all over Europe, but you claim that it's almost impossible to discuss it objectively because of accusations of racism that get thrown at those who raise the question, and prejudices and stuff like that. Say a little bit about the difficulty of having the debate at all before you and I have it.
Yes, I think there's always, at any point, taboos in societies, and there are all sorts of reasons why taboos arise, and they can come from all sorts of directions. And we in our society quite often like to think that we don't have taboos, but we have just as many as any of our predecessors and previous generations had. I think one of them, which I describe in the book, is it partly comes from this deep uncertainty, unawareness, or concern about what we are and where we come from, that we worry about where our own boundaries are, and we have, for the time being, I think, come to the decision that societies like ours are sort of for the world, and that that if you do anything to sort of imply that they aren't for everyone, potentially, then it must be because of some low bigotry. And I think, whilst admitting that such bigotries exist, I think we've hampered ourselves in this, and the discussion does become easier with every year, but we move very slowly because we are wading through a minefield, and we know it.
Migration's clearly a big factor. So let's kind of unpack how you see that. Your argument seems to be that the crisis, if crisis it is, emerged as a result of a series of short-term decisions, kind of unintended things that created long-term repercussions. So unpack the history of that, because in a sense we stumbled into it.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I give a short history of this in the book. It is fascinating that the book focuses really on the central issue, which is the migration crisis that really burst through in 2015. But I just try to explain this is a part of a continuum. You know, there's one of the problems of not discussing things is that conspiracy theory grows. And there are conspiracy theories about this, and they are wrong, as they always are, that in actual fact human error and human failing is always the most dominant cause of things. And I start at the post-war period when European governments, as Angela Merkel admitted in 2010, brought guest workers, as they call them in Germany, into Europe to help rebuild our societies, to rebuild societies like ours. And they did an enormous amount. But even that was based, as Merkel admitted later, on a fundamental misunderstanding. We countries like Britain had assumed that the workers would go home. And quite understandably, they didn't. They wanted to bring their families. They wanted to bring up their children in the society and enjoy the better standard of living they had. And so that was the beginning of a process, and it went on over the ensuing decades. And at various times, it just became harder once the flow began to not continue it. And this, in the last decade in particular, on the continent more than in Britain, because of course we've got our own border arrangements, I think. But the continent in particular found it very hard indeed to draw any border. The recent history, of course, has been that the Schengen area of Europe was meant to mutually police and the boundaries of the outer borders of Europe, whilst letting down the borders between countries within Europe. And this thing, by the way, I should stress this whole issue is made massively more complex because I think people don't have always the information of what is actually happening. I have infinite sympathy and desire to help those people actually fleeing a conflict like that in Syria. And I think we should try to work out sustainable ways to help and assist such people. But actually the migration of recent years into Europe, particularly the boats coming into southern Europe, are mainly not from Syria. The Frontex's own figures show this. Most people are economic migrants, and this is also difficult, isn't it? Because they are also coming from terrible situations. I mean, I've travelled to many of the countries people are leaving from, and you know, it's absolutely understandable that somebody who, for instance, lived in Eritrea would want to get out, or somebody in the north of Nigeria would want to try to get to a place where they could make some money and then bring their families in. The problem underneath this is, and it's, as I say, the bit that's hardest, is that Europe, I think, cannot be the home in the world for anyone in the world who wants to call it home.
Your book makes me uncomfortable because of its toughness, but I'm grateful for the way it challenged my own thinking. One of the things it reminded me of was the inescapable element of tragedy in humanity's moral struggles, captured by Aristotle, whom you reference, and other philosophers, and the idea of competing virtues, good things that are kind of in conflict in a way.
Yes.
You instance the tension between mercy and justice, for instance, and the fact that in the moral life we have to make tough choices, and maybe we've lost a certain kind of moral toughness. Explain some of that thinking to us, please, because in a sense it's part of your deeper approach in the book.
Yes, I'm very glad you pick up on that. The way in which our politics, it seems to me, are structured now, and by that I don't just mean political discussion between politicians, but at a wider level now among us, the general public, is made enormously simple by people. It is, I am a good person, you are a bad person. I am virtuous, you are not. And in actual fact, when you come to a subject as difficult and complex as this one, it is very often the case that you have two competing virtues. It's not a competition between good and evil or good and bad. But in the case of the migration crisis, yes, between justice and mercy, for instance, that one wants to be merciful to the people and generous to people who are, as I say, whether they're fleeing war or whether they're fleeing economic deprivation, are people who you would wish to help. And yet there is also an appeal to justice. And that justice includes an appeal to the justice and the idea that the people of Europe have a right as well, have a right to a place they can call home, which remains recognizable and does not simply become a place given over, as I say, to the whole world. And I wish that if, when having discussions about these very difficult, massive issues of our time, which are way above, elections or the passing parliaments and so on, that when we had these big discussions, instead of it being between, as it were, the fantasy of a cold-hearted sort of right-winger and a generous, open actress, say, which is where a lot of the debate ends up coming down to, that we realize these are far more complicated issues than that, and we must think about it seems to me, in as wide and deep a way as possible. And I think our thinking on this, as on so many other things, has become almost unbearably shallow.
You're listening to Sunday Morning with me, Richard Holloway, in BBC Radio Scotland, and I'm speaking to political commentator Douglas Murray. Douglas, let me come now to the most controversial and challenging theme in your book, Islam. You're afraid that a number of factors will, over time, break the post-Christian liberal consensus that characterises European culture at the moment, and that in time it will be succeeded by a repressive religious culture that took us centuries to tame. I mean, Christianity had to be tamed. It had to be, and I, in my own struggles with it, I think the secular movement actually helped it weaken Christianity and made it better as a result.
Yes.
As a gay man, is this an existential fear for you? Are you afraid that things might tip back? So open up that can of anxieties for us, because I'm trying to figure out how much is personal here for you.
Well, a little bit of it, as I suppose, as it is for everybody, but I try not to approach political or thought or any of my writing through simply the personal, because it's obviously it's not applicable to everyone else. I think we have been surprised by this whole process. I give in the book the example of blasphemy. If you'd have said in the 1990s or so, if you'd have said when I read your book, Godless Morality, first, which made a huge impression on me, when I read that book and others, if people at that time had said, actually, there's going to be the massive issue in the 21st century in Europe, in our freedoms, is going to be blasphemy. Anyone would have said, "What are you talking about? I mean, how is Mary Whitehouse going to come back from the dead to haunt us? Is it going to become the case that the Spanish Inquisition gets going again? We would never have seen really what has happened." And I go back to 1989, of course, as many people have, and the Satanic Verses affair, when the Ayatollah Khomeini issued the fatwa of Salman Rushdie, a British novelist, for writing a novel. And then going through to more recent years with very famous cases like the Charlie Hebdo massacres and attacks on friends of mine who have been shot at on the continent for what they say. And this is now part of our dialogue, part of what we say and what we cannot say. You and I know that there is almost nothing we could say about Christianity that would. I mean, we might get a few letters. There might be somebody, goodness knows, maybe somebody from the Isle of Lewis who would object to something we said about the Trinity or something else. But it actually is inconceivable now, thank goodness, that if we said something about Jesus or about the Trinity or something, that we would be getting death threats within minutes of this interview finishing, and that potentially that whole thing could get very sticky. And I've had that in my own life. A lot of my friends have, and it's, I think, a very bad early warning sign. You see, and people say, well, you don't have to say this. Like people don't have to draw cartoons. And then you think, well, what comes next in that? And it's very worrying how many people are willing to play by what I call the assassin's veto. And it suggests to me in our societies that we're not really as robust as we think we are. And we all want to get on and have a nice life. And it's easier to avoid things, and that way lies a lot of problems in the future.
But I'm comforted by the fact that in many ways we've been here before. Let me give you another historic example of a bad migrant crisis in Scotland's history. It reminded me of a horrible episode during the Irish potato famine. A large migration from Ireland to Scotland, furiously opposed by the Church of Scotland, used racist language, asked the UK government to put a stop to it, only to be told that Ireland was in the Union and freedom of movement was part of it. And it was a hateful episode in our history, and it took well into the 20th century for that hatred to dissipate. They had to have Catholic schools to protect themselves. And now Catholics in Scotland are an integrated, important, contributing part of the culture.
Yes.
So I'm a bit more hopeful that these stresses and tensions will in time get integrated, because they come with a particular cultural and religious package.
Yes.
But they become part of the mix as well. Are you not maybe being too pessimistic?
I obviously think not. I'll tell you why. The example you give is a very pertinent one. But we know that the results of that migration you describe still are felt. We know that. I mean, look at the differences between Catholics and Protestants, Scots and Irish. I mean, they have been in our recent history. I wrote a book some years ago about Northern Ireland, and I mean, these have been huge things in these islands' history, and have caused enormous hatreds, death, persecution, bigotry. And thank goodness in Scotland, and I think in the United Kingdom as a whole, we're apart from in Northern Ireland, where it's obviously getting better, these things have broadly sort of started to die away. Now, the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant is really very minuscule. I mean, if you tried to explain to anyone outside the Christian religion what they are, they have trouble. I would argue that the difference between an Irish family moving to Scotland, say, and an Eritrean family moving to Norway is not the same thing. And that the great hope we have, and I share the hope, I think it's very unlikely. We predicate this whole thing on it has to work. And I think that societies are not just things you can just dump things in and throw things in and place things in by massive bureaucratic measures. I think societies are fragile ecosystems, and that actually if you tamper with them a bit, then there are, over time it can be fine. But that when you make massive changes of demographic and religion and so on, I'm not sure that fragile ecosystem necessarily does survive, or survive in a recognizable form.
But Douglas, given that that's where we are, we're really going to have to do something. I mean, we're going to have to do a kind of an intentional program of integration.
Yes.
And I think you make legitimate criticisms about allowing people to live separately. I guess I'm probably a bit more optimistic about all of this, because it's, in a sense, it's what humans have done. We're a migrant species. We're constantly invading and moving and integrating. And in some ways, America is a great example of what can be achieved. So I'm a wee bit more optimistic than you.
But of course, Richard, we are all of those things you describe, but we are also a species with problems with our frontal lobes, and we war. And that's possible that this will happen this time, that the history of our culture in the future will resemble our bloody past as much as it may represent our very recent, more successful past.
Well, on the eve of Armageddon, you and I will have a good malt whiskey and discuss, whether it actually happened or whether we saved ourselves yet again.
I very much look forward to that drink.
Douglas Murray, thank you for joining us today. Before you go, we're going to have one last music choice, which is the chorus Mysticus from the final movement of Mahler's 8th Symphony. Why this one?
Well, I was asked if I could choose two pieces of music, and you may as well go straight for the best. The end of Mahler's Eighth Symphony is, I think, one of the great achievements of the human spirit. It's the text is from Goethe, Alles Vergängliche. It's all that passes away is only a likeness, and it's one of the great expressions of the human spirit. I think it's actually, of course, a secular, religious cantata, really. This and overwhelming work.
Chorus Mysticus from the final movement of Mahler's Eighth Symphony, conducted by Leonard Bernstein, the final choice of my guest today, political writer Douglas Murray. And Douglas's book, The Strange Death of Europe, is published by Bloomsbury. Coming up after...
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.